I think it would be helpful for people who, maybe up to this point we've been a little theoretical, or, we're kind of talking methodology and all of these things. But for someone who is asking, is Christ present in the Old Testament? And if so, where can I find it? What's like a go-to example that we could start with? Maybe we can get into others as we go. But as one of these test cases of where we see Christ really present in the Old Testament, and maybe also like how we can feel confident in that.
Yeah, yeah. So I think one of the things that helps us feel confident that Christ is really in the Old Testament is when your interpretation of a text is intimately connected to a myriad of other texts, right? Because now it's not just one particular thread which is holding up your entire reading of the Old Testament. It is rather a myriad of mutually complementary and reinforcing threads, which then themselves provide a frame for interpreting other texts. And when you find that frame to be useful, that increases your confidence in the overarching approach that you're taking. Now, it's very hard to put this into words, as you can tell, but this is an experience that I have had over 10 or more years of trying to figure out the logic of the text and finding that with this in mind, with the idea that the incarnation of the Word of God and his redemption of mankind and his death and resurrection is the unifying principle of the Old Testament, with that hypothesis in mind, I feel that I have been able to understand the scriptural texts better and not in a more muddy way. So let me just try to give a summary of how precisely I think is a good way to go about this. And in order to give that summary, I use as a foil what I alluded to before, this idea that, there's X many messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, and you can like list them out on a website and you can show them to your Jewish friends. And then they'll have no choice but to accept that Jesus is the Messiah. Um, I don't like that approach because what it implies is that the Old Testament itself is basically a bag within which certain little bits of paper that you grab out of that bag are going to be messianic, other which might be just narrative or something like that. But in reality, what Jesus talked about in the New Testament is the entirety of the scriptures bearing witness to himself. Beginning from Moses and all the prophets, he exposited them all concerning himself, and we find other passages elsewhere in the New Testament. So what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Well, what it means is we should look for messianic prophecy in literarily significant positions in the biblical text. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the way that a text like the Pentateuch is structured in its totality, and you will find that just like in a home, certain places in the home are of particular significance in bearing the weight of the house. So also there are particular textual seams in the Bible which are significant in bearing the weight of the whole text. So if we look at the Pentateuch, for example, what you find is that the Pentateuch has Genesis 1 to 11, which tells the history of the entire human race down to the dispersion from Babel. And then you have the call and choice of Abraham in Genesis 12, and you move through the story of a single lineage within the human family that is the nation of Israel. Now, Genesis 1 to 11 then, and Genesis 12 to the end of Deuteronomy constitute the introduction and then the main body of the text. And what you find is that these are actually designed in analogous fashion. Genesis 1 to 11, and I'm indebted to John Sailhammer and Seth Postal for this way of thinking about the text. Genesis 1 to 11 is structured in a series of relatively short narratives that are linked together by relatively short poetic seams. So, for example, Genesis 2 tells the story of the creation of Adam and Eve. Genesis 2 concludes with Adam speaking poetically of his bride, as bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, so on and so forth. Genesis 3 tells the story of the fall. It concludes with this poetic series of curses on the ground, on the serpent, on childbearing, and also the promise of redemption. Genesis 4 goes forward with the murder of Abel by Cain. It concludes with a poetic celebration of the birth of Abel as the seed who replaces Cain. And you go forward and you've got poetic announcements of the birth of Noah, so on and so forth, and this runs throughout the whole text. Now, Genesis 12 to the end of the book of Deuteronomy is structured in an analogous fashion, but just on a larger scale. You have large narrative sections which are linked together by large poetic seams. So Genesis 12 to Genesis 48 tells the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and ultimately the descent of Israel into Egypt. Genesis 49 is then a lengthy poem relative to the length of the short poems in Genesis 1 to 11, which includes important prophecies about the destiny of the tribes of Judah and the tribe of Joseph. And then you have Genesis 50, which is the death of Jacob, down to Exodus 14, which is the exodus of Israel from Egypt, where they cross the Red Sea and the armies of Pharaoh are destroyed. And then you have Exodus 15, which is the second major poem in the Pentateuch. And the interesting thing that you find when you study Exodus 15 is you find that the words that it uses to articulate the accomplishment of God in the Exodus are words which go back to Genesis 1 to 11, which link together with Genesis 49, and which link with the other poems in the Pentateuch, because the other ones are Numbers 23 to 24 and Deuteronomy 32 to 33. Now, 3 of these 4 poetic themes in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 3 of those 4 explicitly make reference to the coming of the Messiah. Numbers 24 and Genesis 49 does so very clearly, speaking of a king who is going to be descended from the lineage of Judah, who will have the obedience of the nations. That king in Genesis 49 is spoken of in terms that call back uniquely to the dream of Joseph. We hear in the dream of Joseph about his brothers bowing down to him. Well, the same thing is said in Genesis 49 about the seed who is going to come from the lineage of Judah. And the point I'm trying to make here is that when we're looking at messianic prophecy, what we're not doing is just trying to find messianic texts which are kind of just cast in there at random. You're reading a narrative, you're reading a story, and boom, there's the Messiah. The Bible is structured with a much higher degree of craftsmanship and design, and that means that there's going to be certain passages which are the terms along which you read the rest of the text. And so what is the story that we're getting out of this sequence of poetic themes? If we accept the hypothesis, and I think this bears a lot of fruit if you go through the Bible this way, if you accept the hypothesis that the poetic themes of the story are directing you towards the literary center of the text, what is the result that we get? By the way, I think a useful analogy here, you might actually be like a musical, right? In a musical, you have kind of prosaic parts where it's just like a normal film or a normal play, and then there's an interruption, everybody gets into a song, and that song summarizes kind of the theme of the story which you've just heard, and it anticipates themes of the story you're about to hear. It directs your mind to the center of what the author wants to communicate to you. Well, if you go to that, if you look at the thread along those lines, what you get is God created man as the head of creation through which he would communicate his life to the world, because God is in dialogue with creation throughout Genesis 1, and he brings creation into greater degrees of dialogue with him. I'm writing a whole series of articles on this theme right now, but now I can only motion to it. Man is the head of creation in the sense that creation is man's body, and as man is the image of God, that means God reflects his glory and life into the world through man. And what we find then in Genesis 2 is that the way in which this glory is reflected through man is by human communion in terms of their relationship to God. So God is 1 and 3. He says, let us make in Genesis 1, and he says, let us make only in the context of making man, specifically making man male and female. God is one who can say, let us, and thus he makes man as his image, as one who can also say to other human beings, let us. Again, this has deep resonances throughout the rest of the Bible, and it's not just this particular text. Genesis 2 then shows how man found that it was not good to be alone. Remember, God had been saying, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And now we hear a not good. It is not good for man to be alone. And so God puts man into a deep sleep, divides him in two, and then joins him back together. And for the first time now, man is not called Adam or a man of dust, but he's called Ish, which I would suggest is a play on the word Esh, fire. So man is glorified. Whether or not there's an etymological connection, the word sounds similar, and that connection is used later in the Bible. then you find that it is in that relationship. This is really important. It's in that relationship that everything goes wrong. So you have Adam and you have Eve at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are in dialogue with the serpent, but Adam is absent from this dialogue. Verse 6 of chapter 3 tells us that he was present with her in the garden. He's there at the tree, but yet he is completely standing aloof from what's going on. God created the world through the word. He created man in dialogue with himself. He created man to be a being in communion through dialogue, and that's where we find the fall happening. And so we find Adam goes along with his wife's choice, which he does not attempt to contradict, and it cuts the connection between God and the world. So if man is the image of God through whom God transmits his life to the world, then that connection is severed and it's a cosmic catastrophe. And that is what is explicated in Genesis chapter 3 at the end of that poetic section. We have man is cursed from the ground. Okay, man is taken from the ground. If you think about man standing up on his feet from the ground, you now have a link uniting heaven and earth together. If man is like a tree, well, look at the imagery of trees in the Bible. They link together heaven, earth, under the earth. And Psalm 1 says man is like a tree, and there's other passages which underscore that same thing. So there is a connection between God, man, and world, which is now being broken, and where our attention is being called to this thread throughout these early texts. And so God promises a seed. So I pointed out the tree imagery. Okay, what does a seed grow into? Literally, a seed grows into a tree or a plant. When we talk about human beings having seed, we're speaking allegorically. This is just an example of how allegorical language builds from within the Bible itself. And so God promises that there is going to be a seed of the woman who crushes the head of the death-dealing serpent. That is the messianic hope. Christians from very early days have said this is the first messianic prophecy, and it is amply grounded within the logic of the biblical text itself. So then what's the next poem? Genesis 4. God gave Seth as a seed instead of Abel. The next poem, Genesis 5. At the end of this genealogy, we're being given a lineage in the context of this seed promise. At the end of this genealogy, you have Noah, who brings rest or Sabbath from the curse that had been placed on the ground, and he builds the ark. And then you keep working forward, and you find this language is appropriated in the promises to Abraham. I will make you a great nation. And he will give him a seed. And we find that the promise of that seed is fulfilled in Isaac. And so all sorts of things that go on in the life of Isaac get picked up by later biblical authors in reference to the Messianic hope. And we find that language that is pronounced on Abraham and his seed is then quoted again and pronounced on Jacob in Genesis 27 and following. And then it's quoted and it's pronounced on Joseph and Judah in Genesis 49. And so we find what we have here is this king who's being spoken of in Genesis 49, 8 to 12, is being spoken of in a particular set of language which you can trace systematically back to the beginning of the text to identify him with the seed of the woman in Genesis chapter 3. And then as these prophecies accumulate, more content is added to that overall picture. So when we find that that set of language is being combined with language taken from the life story of Joseph, well, what are we being invited to conclude here? Joseph is a son of Jacob who is rejected by his brothers, who's betrayed for 20 pieces of silver, who's sent to the Gentiles. He goes to the Gentiles, and there he illumines the minds of the Gentiles with the Spirit of God. He's elevated as a ruler among the Gentiles, but dressed in Gentile clothing. His own brothers don't recognize him. But ultimately, his brothers do return to him, and when they come, he forgives them, and thus the Egyptians and the Israelites are reconciled as one family at peace. And that is where the story ends, with Joseph saying, you did this for evil, but God meant it for good, to preserve people alive on the earth. And there you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God meant it for good, even though you meant it for evil. And you have the tree of life to keep people alive on the world. And so those threads are all tied together, and that language is then filtered down into the messianic prophecy to give us a developing portrait. And the same thing is going to happen as you go through these other poetic themes in the Pentateuch.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this clip. If you did, you'll probably enjoy the full interview too, which you can find here. And if you haven't already, you should consider subscribing, which you can do here. Lastly, if you are bought into the vision of Gospel Simplicity, which is bringing simplicity out of theological and historical complexity, you can support the channel by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity or clicking on the link in the description down below. Thanks, and God bless.